October 1944, railway platform, Yorkshire, England. Gefreiter Hans Weber stepped off the transport train into cold British rain. His hands were bound with rough rope. His Wehrmacht uniform was filthy from 3 days of travel in cramped cattle cars. Around him, 200 German prisoners formed uncertain lines. Men from the 21st Panzer Division captured after the Falaise pocket collapsed. They expected the worst. For years, Nazi propaganda had been explicit. The British were cruel colonial masters who showed no mercy. German soldiers captured by the British would face starvation, brutal forced labor, beatings, perhaps execution. Better to die fighting than surrender to such a fate. Hans looked around for the brutality he'd been promised. Instead, he saw British soldiers standing in disciplined formations. Rifles held correctly, uniforms pressed despite the weather. No shouting, no chaos. Just quiet military order that reminded him uncomfortably of German peacetime standards. A British sergeant approached, middle-aged with steady eyes. He spoke in heavily accented but comprehensible German. "You will form orderly lines. You will be searched for weapons. You will then receive water and be transported to the processing center. Anyone causing trouble will be disciplined. Anyone cooperating will be treated correctly. Understood?" The tone wasn't cruel or kind, simply professional. Soldiers addressing soldiers. Hans found himself nodding. The search was thorough, but not humiliating. Personal effects were catalogued and stored, not stolen. Wounded men were separated for medical attention. Then came water. British soldiers moved down the lines with canteens, offering drinks to men who'd been shooting at them weeks earlier. Hans drank. The water was cold and clean. Then something unexpected. A British soldier handed him a tin cup and said almost apologetically, "Sorry about the wait, mate. There's proper tea at the camp." Tea. The British were apologizing for delays in serving tea to prisoners who'd tried to kill them. Hans stared at the empty cup, trying to reconcile this reality with everything he'd been told. Something inside him began to crack. The system of systematic decency. By autumn 1944, Britain held over 400,000 Axis prisoners, Germans and Italians captured in North Africa, Italy, and after D-Day. The camps stretched from Cornwall to Scotland, prefabricated compounds housing anywhere from 500 to 5,000 men each. The system operated under strict War Office directives, balancing security with fundamental respect for prisoners as human beings. The policy came from the top. War Office instructions were explicit. Prisoners would be treated according to Geneva Conventions. They would be worked within legal parameters, fed adequately, housed properly, and disciplined firmly but fairly. This wasn't sentiment. It was calculated policy with multiple objectives. Security well-treated prisoners caused fewer problems. Content men didn't riot or attempt mass escapes. Intelligence. Cooperative prisoners provided valuable information about German units, defenses and morale. Diplomacy. Proper treatment ensured reciprocal treatment of British POWs in German camps, a consideration that mattered deeply to families with sons captured in North Africa or after Arnhem. Morality. Britain was fighting for civilization against barbarism. Maintaining civilized standards, even toward enemies, proved which side represented genuine values. The numbers told the story. Total German POWs in Britain, 1944 to 1948, approximately 402,000. POW camps established, 600 plus facilities. Average daily ration per prisoner, 2,900 calories, more than many British civilians received. Medical facilities, every camp had at least a basic infirmary. Larger camps had full hospitals. Mortality rate, 0.03%, lower than British civilian population. Prisoners assigned to work, 380,000 men. Escape attempts, 1,117 recorded, only 14 successful, all recaptured within weeks. Red Cross inspections, quarterly minimum, camps consistently passed. These weren't propaganda figures. They were documented statistics revealing systematic policy. German prisoners in Britain would survive the war, return home healthy, and carry memories that would shape post-war German attitudes toward Britain and democracy. The arrival and processing. Hans Weber's transport arrived at Camp 186 in Derbyshire on October 20th. The facility held roughly 1,800 prisoners in wooden barracks surrounded by double barbed wire fencing and 8 guard towers. Nothing luxurious, but weatherproof, organized, clean. Processing was systematic. Documentation completed in German by British clerks who'd learned the language for POW administration. Medical examinations conducted by army doctors who treated prisoners with professional detachment. Assignment to barracks. Explanation of camp rules delivered clearly. The efficiency was impressive and unsettling. Britain had clearly anticipated holding massive numbers of German prisoners and prepared accordingly. This wasn't improvised captivity. It was industrial-scale imprisonment executed with British organisational competence. Then came the first meal. Hans had expected starvation rations. Instead, dinner was substantial. Bread, stew with actual meat, boiled potatoes, margarine and tea. More food than his unit had received during the final weeks in Normandy. He sat in the mess hall, staring at his plate, unable to process the disconnect. Around him, other prisoners ate in stunned silence. Some ate slowly, savouring every bite. Others wolfed down food as though it might be taken away. A few wept quietly, not from sadness, but from overwhelming relief of full stomachs after months of hunger. I couldn't understand it, Hans recalled in a 1987 interview. We'd been told the British would treat us worse than animals. Instead, the first night we received proper food, slept in dry barracks with real beds, and weren't beaten. The disconnect was so profound that some prisoners thought it must be temporary, that the real brutality would start once we'd been softened up. It never came. The rules of captivity. Camp 186's rules weren't kind, but they were scrupulously fair, applied equally to all prisoners, regardless of rank or unit. No favoritism, no arbitrary cruelty. Sergeant Major Robert Davies, who supervised guards at Camp 186, explained the philosophy to new personnel. These men fought for Hitler. They killed our mates, bombed our cities, but they're prisoners now, which means they're our responsibility. We don't abuse them because we're not savages. We maintain order through discipline and fairness. That's the British way. We don't need to beat men to show we've beaten them. The barbed wire does that. This restraint, treating prisoners properly because British standards required it, not because prisoners earned it, created distinctive camp atmospheres. Guards didn't fraternize, but showed professional courtesy. Orders were given clearly and enforced consistently. Violations resulted in disciplinary action, typically confinement or reduced privileges, but not violence. The contrast with German treatment of Soviet prisoners was absolute and intentional. Britain was demonstrating that democratic civilization could maintain moral standards even under war's pressures. The work program. German prisoners were assigned work, primarily agricultural labour, that was legal under Geneva Conventions and desperately needed by Britain's war-strained economy. Britain faced catastrophic labour shortages with millions of men in uniform. Farms lacked workers for harvests. Roads needed repair. German POWs provided essential workforce. Hans Weber was assigned to a farm in Nottinghamshire in January 1945. He worked alongside 12 other prisoners, supervised by a British farmer named Thomas Clark, who'd lost his brother at El Alamein. We harvested crops, repaired fences, helped with livestock, Hans recalled. The work was hard. I'd been a shopkeeper before conscription, not a farmer, but not impossible. Clark was stern, but fair. He showed us how to do tasks properly, expected competent work, didn't tolerate laziness. But he also brought us tea during breaks and never raised his hand to anyone. It was honest work for honest treatment. The work program created unexpected interactions. Farmers who initially viewed prisoners with hostility often developed grudging respect for men who worked diligently. Some prisoners learned English through daily contact. Occasionally, British civilians would share cigarettes or extra food, small gestures contradicting German propaganda. Clark, interviewed in 1982, remembered, "They were just lads, really, scared, far from home. My brother died fighting their army, but these particular men hadn't killed William. Hating them wouldn't bring him back, so I worked them hard but treated them fair. That's all you can do, be decent when you can." The program's scale was massive. Prisoners assigned to agricultural work, approximately 380,000. Farms utilising prisoner labour, over 10,000, across England, Scotland, Wales. Primary crops, potatoes, wheat, sugar beets, vegetables. Infrastructure projects, road repair, forestry, drainage. Working hours, 8 hours daily, 6 days weekly. Additional rations for workers, extra 400 calories daily. Wages, small amounts credited to prisoners' accounts. The profound symbolism of tea. Tea became the unexpected symbol of British treatment. Every morning and afternoon, work details received tea breaks. British supervisors would heat water, brew tea, and distribute it to German prisoners exactly as they would to British workers. The gesture was so ordinary that British personnel barely noticed they were doing it. For German prisoners, it was revolutionary. Tea wasn't just a beverage, it was a cultural statement. The British offered tea to everyone, friends, strangers, colleagues, guests. Offering tea to German prisoners meant treating them as human beings worthy of basic courtesy, not as subhuman enemies deserving contempt. Hans remembered his first tea break. Clark called us over, poured tea from a thermos, handed me a cup. No ceremony, no speech. "Just right, lads, 10 minutes. I stood there holding this cup of tea, watching Clark drink his own, and realised he was treating us the same way he'd treat English workers. Not friends, we'd never be friends, but equals in that moment. Human beings taking a break from work. That casualness destroyed every stereotype I'd believed about British arrogance. The tea breaks became deeply symbolic. They represented Britain's fundamental decency, the willingness to extend basic courtesies even to defeated enemies. The fact that guards and supervisors did this without thinking, as pure routine, made it more powerful than any propaganda could achieve. One prisoner wrote in a letter home, "The British give us tea, real tea, twice daily. They share it without hesitation, as though we're workers rather than enemies. I cannot explain what this means, that small gesture of normalcy in captivity. It tells me everything I was taught about British cruelty was lies." Medical care and professional standards, wounded and sick, German prisoners receiving British medical treatment experienced another profound contradiction to propaganda. Camp medical facilities were staffed by British Army doctors and nurses who treated German patients with identical professional standards applied to British soldiers. Medical care was competent, thorough, non-discriminatory. Hans developed a severe infection in his hand during farm work in March 1945. The camp medical officer, Captain Elizabeth Thornton, prescribed antibiotics, ordered proper dressing changes, and assigned him to light duty until healed. "I learned later she'd lost her fiancé at Dunkirk," Hans recalled. "Yet she treated me with complete professionalism, checking the wound, adjusting treatment, ensuring I was healing properly. No coldness, no cruelty, just a doctor doing her job. When I recovered, I tried to thank her. She just said, 'You're welcome. Be more careful with the tools,' as though saving a German soldier's hand was simply what doctors did. This comprehensive care served British interests. Healthy prisoners worked more effectively, but it also demonstrated that Britain valued human life, even when that life belonged to enemy soldiers. The distinction mattered profoundly to prisoners who'd been taught that the British Empire was built on casual cruelty toward inferiors. The Christmas service of 1944. December 1944 brought an incident that crystallized British policy. Camp authorities permitted prisoners to organize Christmas services. German prisoners decorated a barracks with improvised ornaments made from scrap materials. They gathered for religious observance and sang traditional hymns. On Christmas Eve, Protestant prisoners assembled and sang Stille Nacht, Silent Night, in German. The song drifted across the camp in cold winter air, audible to British guards standing watch. The guards stopped talking. They stood quietly, listening. When the song ended, several applauded softly. Sergeant Davies entered the barracks afterward, carrying cigarettes and chocolate, not required by regulations, but offered as gesture of common humanity during holidays. "Happy Christmas, lads," he said simply, distributed the items, and left. Hans remembered that moment. We were singing about peace while imprisoned by enemies we'd tried to kill. The British Guards could have mocked us or forbidden the service. Instead, they respected it. When Davies came in with cigarettes and chocolate, treating Christmas as something that transcended enmity, I understood something fundamental. These weren't the barbarians we'd been taught to expect. They were civilized men treating defeated enemies with dignity we'd never shown anyone during the war. The Christmas service became emblematic of British camp policy. Maintain security and discipline, but recognize prisoners' humanity within those constraints. Neither cruel nor soft, decent. The letters home and propaganda collapse. German prisoners were allowed to write letters home, creating opportunities for propaganda collapse. The letters described adequate food, fair treatment, and humane conditions, contradicting Nazi broadcasts about Allied brutality. When families in Germany received letters saying their captured relatives were healthy and treated correctly, it undermined faith in regime pronouncements. Hans's letter to his wife in February 1945 stated, "I am well and healthy. The British treat us fairly. We work, we eat, we are not abused. Everything we were told about British cruelty was propaganda. I am safer here than I would be continuing to fight. Do not believe what you hear from Berlin about prisoner treatment." His wife, surviving in bombed Cologne, shared the letter with neighbors. The information rippled outward. If Nazi propaganda about POW treatment was false, what else were lies? The promised miracle weapons, the claims about imminent victory, the entire justification for continuing the war. British authorities understood these letters' strategic value. Allowing prisoners to write home served intelligence purposes. But more importantly, letters undermined Nazi propaganda more effectively than Allied broadcast ever could, because they came from trusted family members. The ideological transformation. Extended captivity created ideological transformations among prisoners who compared their treatment with Nazi principles. The process was gradual. Initial shock at humane treatment gave way to acceptance that British weren't monsters. This opened uncomfortable questions. If propaganda about British cruelty was false, what else were lies? The racial theories, the claims about Jewish conspiracy, the entire ideological foundation. Hans described his evolution. In the camp, I had time to think without constant propaganda. I saw British treating us fairly despite having every reason to hate us. I talked to other prisoners who admitted Nazi ideology was bankrupt. I read British newspapers, censored but still providing information we'd never received in Germany. Slowly, painfully, I rebuilt my understanding. I'd fought for evil. I'd believed lies. The British who'd defeated and imprisoned me were more honorable than the regime I'd served. British authorities eventually implemented formal re-education programs with lectures, films, and discussions about democracy and Nazi crimes. But many prisoners had already abandoned Nazi beliefs simply through experiencing British fairness contrasted with memories of regime brutality. The transformation wasn't universal. Some prisoners remained committed Nazis, others became cynical about all ideology, but significant numbers genuinely reconsidered their beliefs, using captivity as opportunity for intellectual reconstruction. The voluntary stays. When repatriation began in 1946 to 47, thousands of German prisoners volunteered to remain in Britain temporarily. The British government, facing continued labour shortages, permitted volunteers to stay as civilian workers. Approximately 25,000 former POWs remained through 1948, working on farms and reconstruction projects while living in civilian housing. Hans was among them. I had nothing to return to. Cologne was rubble. My family scattered or dead. Britain offered work, housing, and possibility of rebuilding life. Many of us stayed voluntarily. We'd been treated fairly as prisoners. Perhaps we could build futures as workers. This voluntary retention demonstrated British policy's success. Prisoners treated fairly became willing workers. Men who'd fought against Britain chose to remain and contribute to British recovery. Some former prisoners eventually immigrated permanently, marrying British women, establishing businesses, becoming British citizens. Their children and grandchildren would grow up British, carrying memories of grandfathers who'd arrived as prisoners and stayed as neighbours. The final departure, Nottinghamshire Railway Station, April 1948. Hans Weber stood at the platform where he'd arrived 3.5 years earlier as a frightened prisoner expecting brutality. Now he was leaving as a free man, carrying British work references and enough savings to start over in Germany. Thomas Clark had come to see him off. The farmer who'd supervised his work taught him English, treated him fairly when hatred would have been understandable. They shook hands. Clark handed Hans a package, tea, biscuits, and a letter of reference. "You're a good worker, Hans. If Germany doesn't treat you right, you're welcome back here. We'll find you something." Hans nodded, unable to speak. He'd arrived expecting punishment and received tea. He'd anticipated cruelty and found decency. Everything he'd believed about British barbarism had proven false. The train pulled away. Hans watched the English countryside pass, fields he'd worked, villages he'd seen, a country that had imprisoned him but never broken him, that had defeated him in war but treated him as a human being in captivity. Years later, living in rebuilt Cologne, working as a shopkeeper again, raising children in democratic Germany, Hans would tell them about the British. Not stories about cruelty or revenge, but about tea breaks and Christmas services, about farmers who'd lost brothers yet treated enemies fairly, about doctors who'd saved German lives despite personal losses. "The British taught me what civilization means," he'd say, "not through lectures or propaganda, but through how they treated defeated enemies. They could have been cruel. We deserved it. Instead, they were decent. That decency, that restraint, that fundamental humanity, even toward enemies, that strength, real strength, the kind Germany forgot and Britain never lost. The enduring legacy. The grey English morning when German prisoners expected punishment but received tea became testament to civilization's resilience. Britain proved that even in total war against an explicitly evil regime, civilized nations could maintain civilized standards. The quiet decency of British POW camps, the weatherproof barracks, adequate rations, routine tea breaks, professional medical care, respect for human dignity, demonstrated truths more powerful than any propaganda. That genuine strength includes restraint, that victory doesn't require vengeance, that treating enemies with basic decency when you've defeated them shows greater civilization than any brutality could prove. For thousands of German prisoners who expected starvation but received food, who anticipated beatings but experienced fairness, who feared execution but found safety, British captivity became their first genuine encounter with functioning democracy. And for Britain, the successful management of 400,000 enemy prisoners with minimal mortality and eventual transformation of many into voluntary workers and democracy advocates proved that civilized values weren't weakness, but foundation of lasting victory. The tea that British guards served routinely, without thinking about it, became the symbol of an entire philosophy. That even enemies deserve basic human courtesy. That civilization means maintaining standards when it would be easier not to. And that true strength is shown not through cruelty, but through unshakable decency.